But we got a question from somebody. Again, we mentioned at the beginning of this podcast
Nice.
about how we want to hear from you guys as well and answer your questions. And so this question might be a little bit more for Pastor Bailey, because I actually don't really know the answer to this one. And Adam, you might. But the question is there somewhere in the Bible where it gives a reason why God was silent for the 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament?
Is there somewhere in the Bible?
Yes.
No, not that I'm aware of. There are reasons that we assume, but in fact, we talked about this just a little bit in our church this morning. It's interesting that question comes up, but there are reasons that we assume that he was silent for 400 years. Well, first of all, let me go back. The Babylonian captivity is what it was the precursor that led up to the 400 silent years. And the Babylonian captivity was 70 years. All right, so there's a reason why the captivity was 70 years. It was not just some arbitrary number. Just God comes out and says, let's stick it to him for 70 years. No, the truth is they had violated 70 years of Sabbaths leading up to the captivity. And in the Old Testament, that was a covenantal breach. God told them, you are to give my land years of Jubilee and years of Sabbath so that the land can replenish itself. And they got greedy. They decided not to recognize God's authority when it came to the land, and so they exploited the fertility of the land and the nutrients of the land, and it made them very, very wealthy people, and wealth led to arrogance, and arrogance led to ungodliness, and and it turned them into a sour people, a bitter and a sour people. And so that was 70 years of Sabbath violations. That was followed by 70 years when they were taken out of the land. And for 70 years, God said, my land is going to get its Sabbaths. The Sabbath is of the Lord. And he said, my land is going to get its Sabbaths. And so then they came back, and of course, they rebuilt the temples, the Zerubbabel's temple, and so on and so forth. And when they came back and all that was reconstructed, same junk. Same stuff all over again. And so there are some of us who, and all of this has to be triangulated biblically off of little shadows of things here and shadows of things there. But the 400 years of silence, and by the way, maybe in the future we could put a link to a sermon, because I'm going to do a whole Sunday morning on the 400 years of silence in our church. But the 400 years of silence, I think, if you look at that pattern, is God's way of saying, you have despised me. And the Old Testament closes with Malachi. He said, you have profaned my table. And they say, wherein have we profaned? You have robbed God. Wherein have we robbed thee? And so it was God's way of taking a people who absolutely would not listen to reason and then just taking the land away from them completely and entirely. And another purpose, I don't know how you guys want me to go on with this or not.
Well, are you referring when God taking the land away from them? That was them being captive in Babylon.
Captive in Babylon, but then there was also a certain spiritual aspect to the 400 years of silence, because if there's two things that the Jews counted on religiously, they counted on dreams and they counted on prophecy, and some of those were pretty intertwined together.
Right.
And so they believed that if a person was not dreaming, God was not completely blessing them. There were a history of dreams. You had Joseph and the dreams that led them to be protected after the recession in Egypt, and so on and so forth. And so they counted on those dreams. Jacob, you remember, had those dreams. And so they counted on dreams, but the other thing they counted on was prophecy. And so when God turned off the spigot of prophecy for 400 years, and again, that's not an arbitrary number. I mean, there's a specificity to that number. We're not talking about 410 years or 390 years. We're talking about 400 years. And so when God's cut off the spigot of that prophecy for 400 years, it was a thoroughly deafening silence. Nothing was being said. And then I think it prepared the way for John the Baptist. The book of Malachi closes in chapter 4 saying that when Elijah comes, the Son of Righteousness is going to be right behind him, and and I think it was a way of garnering the attention of the people and arresting that attention to such a degree that they would be anticipating something, anything, after 400 years of silence, anything would be helpful. And then John comes, and then Jesus comes, and then the 12 come, and then the 500 come, and then the apostles come, and it's just one thing after another. But that was all after the 400 years of silence.
I do have
to technically answer the question, does the Bible comment on it? No, the Bible doesn't give us hardly any information at all.
I do have a question to go with it, I guess. And I've always heard that like part of the reason the 400 years of silence was that, and this isn't really the question, but that God said all that He needed to say.
Yeah, in the Old Covenant.
Yeah, and so I don't know about that. That's not really the question. But my question is even though God was silent, there were still, based on the history of that time period, there was still biblical prophecy being fulfilled, right? Based off like Daniel's statue.
Correct.
Because then right after the Babylonians, it was the Persian Empire, right?
Babylonians and the Persians and the
Darius.
Greco-Romans and the Romans, yeah.
So all of that. So even though God was technically silent, it's like what He had said was still happening.
Correct. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. The prophetic timepiece never stopped ticking.
Right.
It continued to go on and on and on and on, even through the 400 years of silence. But you got to imagine how excruciating that was, because you understand in the Old Testament, God spoke audibly, just like you're hearing me right now. God spoke from the tabernacle audibly to the Jew. Sometimes it was to Moses or the priest or whatever the case was, and then boom, it's gone. There's no. Then the season of the prophets spoke for God, and now the prophets have even been silenced. And it's almost as if God is saying, okay, the next thing you hear is going to be 400 years from now, and it's going to be big news.
I have a can of worms.
Yeah,
I have a can of worms that could be opened. But
who's your worm guy?
Yeah,
my worm guy. I pay way too much for my worms.
You're paying way too much for worms.
But have you ever thought about the difference between the attitude of the Jews post-silence time compared to pre-silence time? Very, very different.
Yeah.
The way the Jews were described to behave beforehand and afterwards, so they were constantly dealing with idols, constantly dealing with marrying outside of their, the other Jews marrying other from other nations and stuff like that. That was the issue that was being dealt with for years and years and years. After the silence, what was being dealt with by Jesus? What was being dealt with was the overly self-reliant spiritual men that had inundated the entire sect of Jewish religion.
Yeah.
Like it was completely run by men that were selfish. They weren't pure in heart. They were selfish in their intentions.
Very
it
true.
seems like there's a very, very big difference. So maybe during this time of silence, they became self-reliant. It was, the prophets.
Oh, yeah, I agree 1,000% with
so they weren't hearing God, so they were
They
panicking.
became God.
Right, and so they're like,
their
okay,
own
let's make
mind.
up some stuff.
They made a stuff about the law, because who they kind of talk to? They can't go to Nathan and be like, yo, Nathan, the law says this. Is this okay? This situation? Nathan's not there. Neither is Malachi, right? Malachi's not there to straighten that out for you. They have nobody.
Yeah.
So who do they rely on? They relied on these. They got rabbis, and you got the different sects where they have the Pharisees,
Sanhedrin,
Sadducees, and all these.
But one thing
guys.
that does seem that's consistent, though, is the scheming. None of that stuff seemed to change to me.
Yeah, well, people are still going to be people, right?
Like,
But
they were still robbing the church or the temple. They were still doing those things.
Yeah.
But the way that they were robbing was also different too, right? So robbing beforehand was we're going to give God less, but it's just okay for us to do so. Robbing afterwards was we're going to give God less and pretend that we're giving them more.
Exactly.
So like they became their own morality.
Right.
I thought they were keeping it for themselves. I thought they weren't giving it all.
They were in both cases.
Well, now, there's something else here that may be astonishing to some of our listeners here. You remember when the veil of the temple was rent in twain, 33 A.D., when Jesus died?
Yep,
The
and
veil
what
of
was
the temple
behind the veil?
There was nothing there.
Nothing.
There's not many people who are aware of the fact that when that veil was rent in twain from top to bottom, that was the biggest, heavenly expose of false religion ever in the history of the world.
Destroyed the entire
Because
religion.
the Ark of the Covenant had been gone since the days of Jeremiah, pre-exile. The Ark of the Covenant had been gone since the days of Jeremiah, and when that veil was rent from top to bottom, the public, the general public, was then made aware that they've been taking the blood of your animals and your sacrifices and just pouring it onto the ground. There's no Ark of the Covenant here.
So then that means that in the 400 years of silence, the Jews, other than the Pharisees or the leader or the priests and all that stuff, the Jews were ignorant to the fact that God was silent.
Yeah.
Who? Yeah, the main populace.
Yeah, they didn't know.
I mean, yeah.
Because that's
I
how
don't
the
know.
only way they knew was to hear him from the man of God, right?
Which brings the
Man.
petrifying question that today, do we really know that God is speaking to us? Or are we entangled in some kind of a man?
I knew he was going there.
We're
I
trying.
knew he was
So,
going.
We ain't got the kind of time to discuss that.
It's
That-
astonishing.
That is a huge question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's insane.
There's a lot to be discussed there.
Yeah, well, we ran out of time for